Good Shabbos. And happy Hanukkah.
Hanukkah.
It's the most wonderful time of the year. And also, for those of us who don't celebrate that other December holiday, it can be a kind of alienating time of year, especially for kids. Most of us have years of experience with this by now and are content with latkes and dreidels. You know, it's still a specific vibe. This season of decorated trees and light bulbs and songs on the radio for a holiday that isn't ours. Heading into a new year that is ours in a certain kind of way, but also isn't. Hanukkah's great. It actually is, and there's so much Hanukkah spirit tonight, especially, for sure. But inevitably, at this time of year, even in small ways, we remember that we're just a little different from the mainstream all around us. Which is, I suppose, what the Maccabees fought for 2,200 years ago, so that we could be different and feel like ourselves. The value of Jewish particularity is, as we know, central to our tradition, even as we often struggle with it as modern Jews. And as this week's Torah portion shows, that feeling of alienation or difference has been a feature of Jewish life since the very beginning of our story. Parashat Miketz opens in medias res. We've already encountered Joseph as a kid and read of his troubles in Egypt. We've seen him go to prison and interpret the dreams of his fellow inmates. And here, the parsha opens in the court of Pharaoh with an almost Shakespearean drama, as the Pharaoh has, wouldn't you know it, some bad dreams. After soliciting explanations from his finest priests and magicians, the royal cupbearer comes forward to say that by chance, he'd encountered an interpreter of dreams while he was in prison. He retells the story about Joseph revealing the secrets hidden in his dreams and the dreams of another inmate. And he says, Visham itanu na'ar ivri eved. And there with us was a youth, a Hebrew, a slave. His precise phrasing suggests more than you might immediately assume. Rashi picks up on this tripartite description of Joseph and offers an interpretation of what each word means. A na'ar, a youth, he says, meant a foolish person unfit for leadership, filled with narishkeit, if you will. An ivri, a Hebrew, meant a foreigner who doesn't even speak the dominant language. And an eved, a slave, Rashi says, meant someone who was not permitted to wear Egyptian aristocratic clothes. The cupbearer offers these three knocks against Joseph, even while he was ostensibly doing him a favor that might release him from prison. In light of these readings, the medieval Yiddish super commentary known as the Tzenorena puts it bluntly. Die Toiva von einem Rishoyim is nicht ganz. The favor of wicked men is never whole or pure. In other words, never trust an employer. Or more accurately, when the cupbearer does this favor for Joseph, it's because he sees an opportunity for himself. In virtually every Jewish commentary about the cupbearer's description, our sages refuse to read the phrase, a young Hebrew slave, as a neutral statement of fact, but instead an indication of how Egyptians viewed the Hebrews. More broadly, ancient Egyptians looked askance at all foreigners. Not only were they unfit to lead, but proper Egyptians would not even eat with them. Later in this very parsha, when Joseph's brothers come to Egypt seeking food, Joseph prepares a meal for them. The text says that the Egyptians ate separately from the Hebrews, ki toevahi l'Mitzrayim, because it would be an abomination in Egypt to do so. Surely this is a foreshadowing of what will come in Exodus, as we read our origin story as a Hebrew nation enslaved by Pharaoh and freed by God. But it's just as well a foreshadowing of Jewish history. kind of ancient prophecy that to be a Jew is always to be a little different from the people around us. Sometimes reviled, sometimes desired, often crossing between the two from time to time. And Joseph, the wise son, represents this sweep of history in his character. Varyingly despised and admired, but never normal. Seeking morality, truth, reconciliation, and God, occasionally vain or self-absorbed, say the rabbis, and generally just trying to hold himself together. Joseph is history's prototypical Hebrew. No surprise then that the word Ivri, meaning Hebrew, is a motif in the Joseph cycle. It appears only one other time in Genesis, referring to Avram, the first Ivri. But otherwise, the word is mentioned only in relation to these stories at the end of Genesis. And then again, early on in Exodus, as a marker of difference between them and the Egyptians. This all makes sense insofar as Ivri, meaning boundary crosser or one who came from elsewhere, most literally conveys a distinction from the majority culture. A few chapters prior to this, when Joseph resists the romantic advances of Potiphar's wife, she frames him, resulting in his imprisonment. And as she lies about what he did to her, she refers to Joseph twice as an Ivri. His Hebrewness is used against him, when his difference might be to her advantage. And then Joseph himself uses the term. Describing his innocence to his fellow prisoners, he says, Ki gunov gunavti me'eretz ha'ivrim, for I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews. We might imagine here that he's grappling with his own identity. A stranger in a strange land, and in this case offering a hopeful entreaty for the cupbearer to remember him because of his strangeness. We know what happens next. After the cupbearer tells Pharaoh about Joseph's talents, Joseph frees him to interpret his dreams. Joseph does so, and he is rewarded, catapulted to second in command of all of Egypt. Pharaoh gives him an Egyptian name, Tafnat Paneach, and an Egyptian wife, Osnat. And if the Egyptians see him as an Ivri, albeit an assimilated one, his brothers don't recognize him as one of their own. He is yet again in between, some combo of Yosef and Tzafnat Paneach. They're not necessarily in conflict, but still we can ask the question, how does he see himself? We get a hint from the fact that Tzafnat Paneach never appears again in the narrative. But maybe a better clue is in what he names his children. First comes Manasseh, meaning God has made me forget my parental home. And then comes Ephraim, meaning God has made me fertile in the land of my affliction. In each of these names, Joseph betrays his own ambivalence. He is a Hebrew tasked with the well-being of all of Egypt. And he has to find some way of balancing both his identity and his role. But lest we forget, Manasseh and Ephraim are Hebrew names, not Egyptian ones. And each is in reference to the Hebrew God, not to the deities of Egypt. You could say that this means that Joseph's Hebraishkeit, his Jewishness, his Hebrewness, wins the day. And that is true in a way. But I think the real lesson here is that Yosef finds a way to be both. Truly Hebrew to his core, and also second only to Pharaoh in his Egyptianness, striking a balance between particularist and universalistic commitments, as all of us must as modern Jews. I think sometimes that we set up a false dichotomy in American Jewish life, that you're either authentically Jewish or you're assimilated, falling somewhere on a continuum between each. But perhaps that isn't actually how this goes. Maybe there is a way for Jewishness and Americanness to enhance one another, one candle lighting another, increasing in light without losing the brightness of the former. This may be the exact opposite of what the Maccabees actually wanted when they rededicated the altar in Jerusalem. But despite the prognosticating of those who tell us that American Jews are 1 foot out the door, I feel confident in our ability to be authentically ourselves as Jews, as we are doing tonight in such profound ways, even as we participate fully in mainstream culture. It requires more internal struggle, maybe, but Hanukkah invites us to think about how to do exactly that. Especially at this season, the Sfat Emet teaches us, when lights were miraculously lit for Israel, even though they did not have enough oil, there remains light even now to help us with the aid of the Hanukkah candles, to find that hidden light within. By the power of inwardness, he writes, we can find the hidden light within all of the internal parts that make us who we are. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.